Welcome back. Now, the attack on author Sir Salman Rushdie at an event in New York has again raised questions of freedom of speech and the right to protect it.
Well, over the weekend, the controversial comedian Jerry Sadowitz had his Edinburgh Festival show cancelled following complaints. So, should we be allowed to cause offence, or should there be limits? Here's Liz Summers. Joining us now is Tom Slater, editor of political magazine Spiked Online, who says you have to be able to offend people, otherwise we don't have free speech. And journalist Martha Gill, who believes people hide behind the phrase free speech as a way of justifying the offence. It's difficult to know where to begin. I hope you don't mind. I'll start with you, Martha, because it seems to me the burden's on you when it comes to making a case for limiting free speech. It's a quick story, I haven't had enough time. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. He used to take my brother and I to Speaker's Corner, where you could listen to what people say. It wasn't keyboard warrioring. And sometimes it was anti-Semitic bile, and he'd say, you see, in this country, this man can say anything because he knew the value of free speech, and that was the price of democracy under the rule of law. It's why people, including our grandparents, sometimes our parents at home, even people alive today, fought and died for that value. Why do you say that's not a value worth defending?
Well, as you say, we do have a lot of free speech in this country. You can say almost anything that you want, depending on audience, of course. I think that I'm arguing not for all censorship. I think free speech is very important, but that there is a line. You know, for example, there are topics, there are hate speech laws. I think it's important to have a few of those. You know, you don't want people inciting terrorist action.
Those are already illegal.
Yes, and I think that's limits on free speech, isn't it?
Right.
And I think those are important limits on free speech.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain... Sorry?
Who says they're not limits on free speech? I mean,
well, the right to say whatever you want, no matter who you offend, is limited by those laws. And I think, quite rightly, there are other limits on free speech on topics on which there is large social consensus, and in particular, and to particular audiences. For example, a topic on which would alienate all of your audiences. I think you have the right to make the commercial decision not to bring defendants of those views. Take, for example, something completely outrageous. There was a Society for the Protection of Paedophiles back in the 70s. I don't think you'd want to chair a debate on here with somebody defending those views, and I think you'd be quite right to stop a speaker speaking, or somebody defending the Holocaust to your audience. Denying the Holocaust to your audiences. I think there are some limits, and I think that different institutions should have the freedom to express their views as companies and institutions by not hosting people with particular views.
OK, well, Tom, what do you make of that, then? The fact that, you know, yes, we should have free speech, but there should be a line, there should be limits to that.
I think it's actually something quite grotesque about talking about limits on free speech in the wake of what we saw on Friday. If you don't have the right to offend, you don't have freedom of speech. No one's ever been attacked or locked up for saying something that upset absolutely no one. And I think what we saw in New York State is the horrendous logical endpoint of this ideology that we now have. If you elevate taking offence as like some great moral crime, if you say that speech is violence, the consequence of that is violence and unreason and a society which is less harmonious. And if we're talking about hate speech, if we're talking about the most bigoted ideas imaginable, no one's mind has ever been changed, no idea has ever been defeated by just silencing it. And this is the lesson of history as well. I mean, people always talk about hate speech laws as, you know, you need them because otherwise Nazi Germany will come back, crudely put. That's how the argument is. Weimar Germany had hate speech laws, and Nazis were prosecuted under it, and they used it as a propaganda exercise, and it certainly didn't stop them in their tracks. Hate speech, even extreme speech, the answer to it is more speech. But I think the problem we have today is there's all kinds of views which are not even nearly that extreme, which are being silenced either by law or by social customs. So
well, that's
we're far
certainly
beyond
the point.
those
But Martha's point, I mean, thinly valid, is the idea that there are certain arguments that are beyond the pale, and that private companies and private spaces should be able to, what you might describe as no platform them, because they give them legitimacy. If you put them on at university, or you put them on here and her paedophile example, what would you say to that, Tom?
Well, I think the bounds for that are shrinking so much. We've got to take it very, very seriously. I mean, we're not here talking about Holocaust denial or about pro-paedophilia propaganda anymore. If you think about some of the big free speech discussions we've had in recent years, a lot of them centre around, say, gender-critical feminists who care about the issue of women's spaces and biological sex. People have been arrested for expressing those views. People have lost their jobs for expressing those views. That is not some moral majority asserting itself. That is actually quite a narrow, elite position on that particular issue, which is being imposed across the board. You know, we talk about, the Satanic Verses wouldn't get published today, which is almost undoubtedly true. We could be in a position where Harry Potter wouldn't get published today, not because of its content, but because of its author's views. And if you don't believe me, if you look at some of the authors who are much less prominent than J.K. Rowling, the flack they got and the work that they lost just for supporting her, I think shows us how bad.
I think, Martha, you've a strong view in response to that. So.
Well, I think, obviously, when debates are still open, when debates, for example, with the competition of two oppressed groups fighting for rights, they're still very much open, you need to have complete free speech on those topics. I'm saying there is a line somewhere for particular debates which are flatly over, like, is it OK to black up? No, it's not. We've decided that as a society a long time ago, and that topic is rightly taboo. If we reopen that debate, it's actually sort of damaging in a way to free speech, or at least public discourse, because it suggests that all debates can go round and round and round forever, and we can never make any progress with them. You know, also, you know, what you're sort of suggesting is that all audiences have to tolerate any views.
That's not what I'm suggesting.
Well,
people don't like...
Sorry, I'm sorry to... He didn't suggest that. I mean, you have freedom. You have the freedom to switch off. You have the freedom not to attend. You have a comedian who was cancelled. He had...
You were arguing that was wrong for that venue to not host him.
He had specific warnings about the offence that might be caused. Now, I think you're probably right. There are social mores. I wouldn't want to go and listen to homophobia. I wouldn't want to listen to anti-Jewish racism any more than any other form of racism. The reality is society's already met that response. You can't see it on television. That's not a form of censorship. It's the way we've evolved. I wonder if you can help me with this Orwell quote. You as a journalist, you know, across the board, that for liberty to mean anything, it must mean the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. Sometimes people may not want to hear things. How do we maintain freedom with your position, Martha?
I think there's quite a lot of confusion here with the two topics that we started with. You can't compare an illiberal regime like the one in Iran that issued the fatwa to a liberal one. In liberal societies, taboos tend to accumulate to protect oppressed groups, but the same people pushing for that reduces the number of taboos about speaking about dominant groups. Like, it's much easier now to criticise the dominant religion in this country, Christianity. It's much easier to talk about the monarchy. It's much easier to criticise politicians over time and, you know, talk about sex and things like that, even as other taboos are building. In illiberal societies, it's the other way round. Dominant groups use the full force of the law to crack down on anyone criticising the ruling groups. You can say whatever you like about women and gay people. There's huge amounts of freedom of speech there. You can say all kinds of disgusting things about the people at the very bottom of society. So what we're looking at is not really... And also, in this country, the people who tend to resist wokeism are also the people who wouldn't hear anything bad said about the Queen. You often find...
I would happily hear many bad things said about the Queen, but I should just say, what you're talking here is essentially about punching down, right? And yet what we're talking about in relation to Salman Rushdie or many of the other scandals, Batley Grammar, all these different situations, is essentially a blasphemy law being erected by the back door. If we're talking about punching up and punching down, I can't think... If you were talking about gods and prophets and religions, I can't think that you can punch much higher than that. Yeah. And this is really important. What we're doing with all these issues, and we're tying ourselves in knots, is we're limiting free speech and we're undermining something like the right to offend, something like the right to blaspheme, which freedom of speech in this country and around the world is built on. And we've got to be very careful.
No, sorry, and this could go on all morning, couldn't it? It's
could.
Fascinating hearing your views, but we will have to draw that to a line. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. That's Tom and Martha.